Hey guys, my name is Dawn and I am your week 2 content review presenter. This week, our content had a basis in social perception and all of the ideas that surround. I want to start off by defining self concept, which is the sum of an individual's beliefs about his or her personal attributes. And this sum is made up of our self schemas, which are the beliefs that people hold about themselves, which guide the processing of self relevant information. For example, someone who may feel like they're outgoing, or someone who may feel like they're overweight, or things like that. Schematic self schemas are things that we actually attribute to ourselves. So if we're overweight, that would be, or weight would be a self schema that we do attribute to ourselves, as opposed to someone who is not overweight and doesn't pay much attention to this idea. This is in a schematic schema for them. So, going to the basis of the self concept, Gordon Gallup did a study where he used different animals and he put them all in front of a mirror. And during the study, only the apes recognized themselves after several days. And as an extension to the study, he painted red dye on the animals' faces. And again, the apes were the only ones to recognize themselves in the mirror. With the red paint, they were touching themselves, and before they were blowing bubbles and making silly faces for entertainment and picking things out of their teeth and things like that. And Tanya Broche did a similar study with children in different countries, and she painted the red paint on the children's faces, put them in front of a mirror, and examined how they would recognize themselves. And Americans did the best at 88% pass rate, while children in Kenya and Fiji had 2 and 0 children who were able to pass this test. And it wasn't decided that these children don't recognize their self images. It was we believe that, or it was thought that they comply, that they were raised to comply, and so they didn't think to touch their faces because that wasn't what they were told to do. Um, so this kind of brings up the question as to whether the mirror test can be used to measure self-concept, considering the fact that different cultures may react to this type of study in a different way. So where do our self-concepts come from? Introspection is one route in which this is a way of looking inward at your own thoughts and feelings. It's said that self knowledge is derived from self introspection. Richard Nisbet and Timothy Wilson did a study that showed that participants often could not explain the cause for their own personal behavior. And the book states that there are two reasons for this. People are so mentally busy processing information, we often don't understand our own thoughts and behaviors. And people also overestimate the positives in the sense that a lot of people think that they are better than others. Daryl Bem's self perception theory states that people can learn about themselves just by watching their very own behavior. And the facial feedback hypothesis states that changes in facial expression can lead to corresponding changes in emotion. And further, expressive behaviors provide sensory feedback and influence our feelings. So, our self concepts also come from other people. According to the social comparison theory, we evaluate ourselves based on our own comparisons to others. And there is a two-factor theory for emotion, which they said emotion requires physiological arousal and cognitive interpretation of that arousal. We also use autobiographical memories, flashbulb memories defined by Roger Brown and James Kulik. They're detailed, high resolution memories. In the book, it used the example of your memory of where you were maybe during significant events like 9/11, or when John F. Kennedy was assassinated on that day and that time, and that you found out in particular. But people tend to distort the past to inflate their own sense of importance just naturally. Henry Barrick and his colleagues. Did a study where they had college students try to recall their high school grades, and it was clear that for the students who, or for the classes that they did not do as well in. There was a little bit of tweaking in there, and they were kind of trying to inflate those grades a little bit. So people also get their self concepts from their culture. We have individualistic and collectivist cultures that we looked at here in the book, and individualistic are American or cultures like American cultures where we value independence, self reliance, autonomy, and assertiveness, as opposed to a collectivist culture focus on fitting in. They focus on the group and the community, harmony, together, interdependence, cooperation, and things like that. Marcus and Connor present the idea that with our culture style, there are four I's that shape how an individual thinks, feels, and acts, which are the ideas that they have, the institutions that they are involved with, the interactions that they have, as well as their individual aspects. So, collectively, our self esteem is our positive and negative evaluations of ourselves. According to the self discrepancy theory, our self esteem is the mismatch between how we see ourselves versus how we want to see ourselves. And answering the question, why do we need self esteem? The sociometer theory states that we use our social interactions to determine whether our behavior is acceptable or not. And the terror management theory states that humans have such a fear of death that they construct and accept cultural worldviews just to help them preserve their self esteem as a coping mechanism. And Jennifer Crocker and Laura Park state that there is that it could be costly in pursuing self esteem. Because there are a lot of things that at the end of the road you could end up with not the resolution that you're thinking you might have, which could at the end of the day be a detriment to your self esteem. And overall, African Americans were shown to have the highest self esteem among whites, Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans. And it was said that it was possibly due to the fact that African Americans are able to put off any negativity and say that it's just discrimination instead of taking it personally. So, the study done by Valkenburg, Peter, and Schuin was a study that examined the consequences of social media networking sites. Um, the study looked at the idea that adolescent self esteem is closely related to an adolescent's well being. And it also had the theory that the use of networking sites increase the chance to form relationships on the site and receive reactions on their profiles. And this is in the sense that the more that the student would use it, the more reactions and positive feedback they would be getting. This study was done on 881 Dutch adolescents who were ages 10 through 19. So, this study measured the use of the networking site, the frequency of the reactions to the profiles, the tone of the reactions on the profiles, the relationships established through the site, which was called CU2, the adolescent self esteem, as well as the adolescent's well being. The results showed that adolescents typically visited the site for an average of 3 days per week for an average of 30 minutes each time that they did visit the site. 78% of the adolescents reported receiving positive feedback, while 7% were receiving predominantly negative feedback. 35% established a friend or a friendship, and 8% established a romantic relationship. And the number of relationships formed did not seem to be affected by the self-esteem. It seems that the quality of the adolescent's relationship shows better signs of adjustment as opposed to the number of relationships that a adolescent has. And the adolescent self-esteem only seemed to be affected by the tone of the feedback they received on their profile. Positive feedback enhanced their self-esteem, while negative feedback did the opposite, of course. And research shows that people can enhance their social media presence. So there's kind of a little bit of I guess, a limitation or discrepancy in there in the sense that some adolescents may be better at enhancing this social media presence as opposed to some other adolescents. And that factor was not looked at in this specific study. The self awareness theory states that certain situations force us to turn our attention inward, which we don't normally do. So, when we do look inward, we notice our self discrepancies and things like that. And this was shown during a study where participants were seated in front of a mirror, and it was shown that when they were placed in front of the mirror, they tended to react more negatively towards their self discrepancies once they did have that moment to look inward. But in contrast, the Japanese, who, well, in the Japanese culture, they seem to be unaffected by the presence of the mirror. And this might be because in the Japanese culture, you are looked to be as a group and things like that. So you're already looking at yourself as a whole. You're already paying attention to your image and things like that all the time in their culture. So being in front of a mirror is nothing for them. And Bayman did a cute little study with some trick or treaters where she put a mirror in the trick or treating bowl, and she told the trick or treaters, you all can get some candy, but only gave them a certain amount that they were supposed to get. And she noticed that, or she would tell them that they can get this candy, and then she would leave. And she noticed that when she placed the mirror there, there was less chance that children would take more candy as opposed to when the mirror wasn't there. They just kind of did whatever they wanted and took as much as they wanted. Self regulation is a process of controlling your thoughts, feelings, or behavior in order to achieve a personal or a social goal. And a study done by Hoffman showed that the conflicts between our desires and the need for self control are constantly going on. And Kathleen and Todd did a study that showed self regulation fatigue, which was really just showing how if you are constantly trying to exhibit self control and things like that, it's going to get harder and harder and harder. Because it over time it's more difficult to hold yourself back from your desires. And Wagner kind of follows this idea in the sense that with the ironic mental process, he states that the harder you try to exhibit a thought, feeling, or behavior, the less likely you are to succeed, which is goes right along with your self-regulation fatigue. So, ways that we self enhance ourselves, we use a better than average effect, which is the sense that we just look at ourselves and just consider ourselves as being better than everyone else, we'll say. And our implicit egotism is the idea that people are quicker to associate self with positive words as opposed to negative words. Self handicapping is a behavior designed to sabotage our own performance in order to provide an excuse for failure. Which is like if you're coming up with an idea because you were late to work or something like that, you might tell your boss that your car broke down or you got a flat tire or something like that. Something that didn't allow you to be able to do what you were supposed to do. And there is basking in the reflected glory, which is an increase in self esteem by surrounding yourself with other successful people. So it just makes you feel like you're doing just as well. And the last mechanism is downward social comparison, which is a defensive tendency to compare ourselves to those who are worse off just to make ourselves feel a little bit better. So, social perception is defined by the process by which people come to understand each other. And the three elements of social perception include your physical appearance, which is the first impressions that we receive as social perceivers, situation perception, which is how people predict the goals, behaviors, and outcomes in familiar settings, and nonverbal verbal behavior, as body language and anything that is not verbal behavior, of course. And according to Bon and DePaulo and Vrij, people are only about 54% accurate when judging truth or deception, very contrary to what others may think. So, attribution theories are a group of theories that describe how people explain the causes of behavior. And examples of these theories are Jones and Davis's theory, which states that we attempt to understand others by observing and analyzing their behavior. And Kelly's covariation theory states that people attribute behavior to factors present at the time of behavior and absent when the behavior is absent. And there are many attribution biases, which are caused by by our limited ability to process relevant information. We lack the training needed, and we lack the regard for projected attributions and our personal hopes, wishes, and preferences. So, this study focuses on negative word of mouth communication. It has a list of hypotheses, which are all related to, portions of them are related to varying negative word of mouth configurations in which they looked at high and low consensus, high and low distinctiveness, and high and low consistency of the information that is being shared, and looked at when these things are placed in high and low situations, how they affect the attributions that do result from them. The study also examined the strength of brand attributions as well as communicator attributions. Um, the study uses the attribution theory to explain consumers' responses against negative word of mouth communication. It used 192 male and female undergraduate students who were randomly assigned to one of six cells. Each cell consisted of one of three negative word of mouth communication information scenarios and one of two brand names in which they used either a lower known or less known brand name versus a more well known brand name. The participants were given a booklet containing instructions, a transcript of negative word of mouth communication, and a related questionnaire. And they were to listen to a recording of two people who were having a negative word of mouth communication. This study showed that both brand and communicator attributions mediate negative word of mouth communication as well as post exposure brand evaluations. Consumers generate causal attributions in response to negative word of mouth communication, and results show attributions used to influence future brand evaluations. And a combination of consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency information lead receivers to have differential responses. Um, and the strength of brand name definitely influences consumers' responses to negative word of mouth communication, and that for the brands that are more known, the attribution would more typically go towards the communicator as opposed to the brand. The participants were more likely to attribute the negative information to the brand when they were exposed to high consensus, high distinctiveness, and high consistency. And the way a communicator structures negative word of mouth communication can influence how the receiver responds and directs their attributions. Receivers attribute negativity to the communicator when the information is more ambiguous, less developed, or both. People were more likely to make stronger communicator attributions for favorable brands than for less in this study, and positive brand names protected the brands from the effects of negative word of mouth communication, especially when the communicator had weak or ambiguous word of mouth communication. So, part two of the study was designed to determine which explanation most accurately explains why consumers generate different attributional responses, which were high consensus information is sufficient to elicit brand attributions, or the idea that high levels of all three information dimensions lead participants to generate predominance of brand attributions. Um, this study consisted of 259 undergraduate students from an intro marketing class at a university. They were assigned to 4 cells as opposed to 6 in the first study, and the brand name and strength held constant during this study. And it was resulted that when levels of distinctiveness and consistency vary, high levels of consensus information is not sufficient enough for consumers to attribute the negativity of a word of mouth communication message toward the brand. Also, low levels of distinctiveness could be an important factor in leading receivers of negative word of mouth communication to attribute negative attributions toward the communicator. And when the distinctiveness, the consistency, and the consensus are all high in levels, the receivers generate stronger brand attributions compared to other configurations. So overall, negative word of mouth communication is definitely significant. Through our social perceptions, we run into confirmation biases. Belief perseverance is an example, which is a tendency to maintain beliefs even after they've been discredited. So, within using our self perceptions, we run into confirmation biases. Belief perseverance, for example, is a tendency to maintain beliefs even after they have been discredited. And the self fulfilling prophecy, as an example, is one's expectations about a person eventually leads that person to confirm those expectations. So, for example, if you meet someone for the first time and they do one thing and you think that they're a rude person, you're probably going to react to them a little bit more rudely as opposed to if you thought that they were a warm and loving person. And your reaction to them and you acting a little bit more rude, or I guess just a little bit more standoffish towards a person, may incite those actions in them as well. And this prophecy has 3 steps, in which step one, the perceiver performs impression of the target, like I said, which is when you meet someone and you automatically get this whole rundown of how you think they are. And then step two, the perceiver behaves in a manner that is consistent with the impression, which is, like I said, you are acting in a way that you think that this person is rude or whatnot. So you are acting a little bit more rude, and the target unwittingly adjusts his or her behavior to the perceiver's reactions, because when this person starts to feel like you are rude, then their actions may get a little rude as well. All right, you guys. So to close, we have 2 questions, which are: how can we integrate what we've learned of social perception into our biblical understanding? And consider the numerous times we have all unwittingly been either a culprit or a victim of social perception bias. How can we prevent our bias in our social perceptions? Thank you guys so much for listening, and I apologize for the extended video, but it was a very long chapter, so I had a lot of information. Thanks for listening, guys.